There are old photographs that, though faded with age, still retain a certain light in them that is hard to name, as if the photographer knew that someday someone would return to find out what they had hidden. Tonight's story on Sleepy History Tales begins with a family photo taken in 1910, seemingly ordinary, but among those solemn faces there is a small symbol that no one has ever noticed. It is that symbol that leads Margaret O'Sullivan on a journey to discover a secret network that has existed for more than a century, where ordinary families have secretly preserved human knowledge, hiding it in photos, symbols, and diaries. Who did they leave it to? And what were they trying to hide from the world? Before we begin, where are you watching this video? Share a little in the comments. I love hearing from history buffs all over the world. And if you haven't already subscribed to Sleepy History Tales, so you can join me on my journeys that are quiet, mysterious, and a little chilly like tonight. The photograph you're looking at now was taken in 1910, a simple family portrait, or so it would seem. But hidden within this image lies a symbol that no one has ever been able to explain. And once you see it, you'll never quite forget it. The rain was steady that evening, whispering against the tall windows of the Riverside Historical Society in Portland, Oregon. Inside, surrounded by the gentle hum of old lights and the faint scent of paper and dust, Margaret Chen worked alone. For more than 20 years, she'd devoted her life to preserving other people's memories. But that day felt different. Her hands trembled not from age, but from the strange weight of anticipation that came with the cardboard box sitting before her. Inside were family photographs, each carefully wrapped, each fading quietly into history. Until she reached one, the portrait that would stop her breath. A sepia-toned image of a family of 5. The father stood tall behind his seated wife, his eyes stern but steady. The woman wore a dark dress laced with care, and around them stood 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, faces solemn, frozen in time. Below the image on a small brass plate were the words, "The Whitmore Family, 1910. Margaret lifted the photo closer to the lamp. The clarity was remarkable too, perfect, almost unsettlingly so. She could see every strand of hair, every carved line in the porch behind them, even the faint texture of fabric. And then she saw it. On the collar of the youngest child's shirt, barely visible, almost lost in shadow, was a symbol. Tiny, deliberate, and strangely beautiful. It looked like a weave of circles tangled with vines or branches. Something botanical, but also something else. Something she couldn't quite name. Her breath caught. She reached for her magnifying glass, leaning in until her pulse matched the soft ticking of the wall clock. Under magnification, the symbol revealed impossible detail. Tiny ridges and interlocking lines so fine they seemed to shimmer. It couldn't be random. It had been placed there, hidden in plain sight. The note attached to the donation said the photos came from an elderly woman named Eleanor Hartwell. Her grandmother had once been a seamstress in Portland's early days, but the note mentioned nothing of the Whitmore family, nor of any connection between them. Just that the photos might be of interest. Margaret set the picture down gently and exhaled. After 30 years, surrounded by ghosts of the past, she had learned to trust her instincts, and every instinct told her this. This quiet family portrait was not what it appeared to be. Something about it had been waiting. The next morning, The air outside was crisp and bright, but her thoughts were still caught in the sepia shadows of 1910. She arrived early at the society, unable to shake the image from her mind. All night she had combed through records. No trace of a Whitmore family after 1912, as though they had simply vanished. At 10 a.m., Dr. James Rodriguez arrived, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, known for his gentle way of handling old photographs. He'd seen nearly everything the early 20th century had to offer, but not this. Under his specialized lighting, the portrait seemed to glow faintly. He nodded slowly. "Exceptional quality for its time," he murmured. "Whoever took this knew exactly what they were doing." "But what was it you wanted me to see?" Margaret pointed to the child's collar. Dr. Rodriguez leaned in, adjusted his lenses, and then froze. "My God," he whispered. "This isn't embroidery, and it's not a pin either." Margaret frowned. "Then, what is it?" He hesitated before answering. "It looks as though the symbol was integrated into the photograph itself during development. The grain around it is completely different. Someone added it after the image was taken, but with a method I've never seen before." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Added on purpose. But why would anyone do that?" Dr. Rodriguez sat back, eyes still fixed on the image. "I've studied thousands of photographs from this era," he said softly, "but never one like this." And in that moment, with the rain returning to the windows and the room falling into silence, both of them understood they had just opened the first door to a secret that had waited over a century to be found. Dr. Rodriguez leaned closer to the photograph, his brow furrowed. The technology to alter images like this simply didn't exist in 1910, he murmured. "At least, not in any studio I've ever known." They spent the next hour in near silence, studying every corner of that century-old image. Everything else seemed ordinary. The lighting, the shadows, the delicate play of sunlight across the porch railings, all consistent with 1910 photographic techniques. And yet, that symbol. It seemed to live outside the photograph's own time, as though it had been placed there by hands that understood something no one else did. Dr. Rodriguez adjusted the focus again, then pointed toward the background. "Look at the house," he said quietly. "The window frames, the porch columns, the arrangement of the gables. That's Portland's Alphabet District early development, maybe 1905 to 1910. Margaret jotted a note. She'd go there next. If the house still stood, perhaps it would whisper the rest of the story. As Dr. Rodriguez packed his tools, his expression turned thoughtful. "In 40 years of studying old photographs," he said, "I've learned that when something seems impossible, it's not magic, it's information we're missing." He looked back at the image. That symbol wasn't an accident. Whoever placed it there wanted it to last, and the method used... He hesitated, lowering his voice. Whoever did this knew things that shouldn't have been possible in 1910. Margaret didn't sleep that night. The next afternoon found her standing on the porch of a small bungalow in southeast Portland, surrounded by overgrown rose bushes. The home belonged to Eleanor Hartwell, the woman who had donated the photographs. She was 87, with silver hair pinned neatly at her neck. Her movements slow but assured. "I wondered when someone would come asking about those," she said, smiling faintly as she led Margaret inside. Her voice trembled with age, but her eyes, sharp steady, held a certain expectation. My grandmother always said those pictures carried secrets, but she never told me what kind. Margaret laid the Whitmore portrait on the table. The moment Eleanor's eyes met it, her expression changed, first recognition, then something darker. Grandmother Rose spoke of this family often, she whispered. She was their seamstress, back when women made everything by hand. Mrs. Whitmore, she was particular, demanding. She wanted patterns sewn into seams where no one would ever see them. Margaret leaned forward. What kind of patterns? Geometric ones, Eleanor replied softly, tracing invisible lines in the air. Precise, almost mathematical. She'd bring fabric samples and insist they be stitched exactly as she described. Not for decoration, but for precision. Grandmother never understood why. Margaret's pulse quickened. Did she keep any examples? Eleanor nodded. She crossed the room and opened a small worn desk. From a hidden drawer, she retrieved a leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and delicate. She wrote everything down, Eleanor said. Measurements, materials, sketches. She said a good seamstress must always remember. Inside, Margaret found detailed records entries labeled Whitmore, 1908 to 1912. There were notes about fabric choices, threads and stitches, but what caught her attention were the drawings. Intricate patterns of interlocking circles and botanical shapes, eerily similar to the symbol in the photograph. Margaret glanced up. Did she ever say why Mrs. Whitmore wanted these? Eleanor shook her head slowly. She said they were family traditions, symbols passed down for generations. But grandmother didn't believe her. She said the Whitmores were different, educated in ways that weren't common then. Even the children, especially the youngest boy. She said he could read. Latin spoke of machines and sciences she'd never heard of. The pieces began to take shape in Margaret's mind. A family of scholars hidden in plain sight. A symbol carefully embedded into a portrait. A message meant for someone who would one day know how to look. The address in Rose's notebook led her to a quiet, tree-lined street in Portland's Alphabet District, where Victorian houses still stood like silent witnesses to another time. Number 847. Northwest Everett Street, the Whitmore home still existed. Though converted into apartments in the 1950s, its ornate, trim, curved porch and unique window patterns were unmistakable. Margaret stood on the sidewalk holding the photograph beside the house. It matched perfectly. The current owner, a kind man named David Park, met her at the gate. The house has its stories, he said with a small laugh. I've been restoring it for years and I keep finding odd things. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnish and dust. The floors creaked softly underfoot, each sound echoing like memory. David led her to the main parlor. This, he said, kneeling beside the wall, is where I found something unusual. He pried away a loose piece of paneling, revealing a hollow space. From within, he drew out a small metal box, tarnished but intact. It was no ordinary box. On its lid was the same symbol, the interlocking circles with vines that Margaret had seen on the child's collar. Perfectly etched, impossibly precise. Have you opened it? She asked quietly. David shook his head. I thought about it, he admitted. But it felt wrong. Like I wasn't meant to. With care, Margaret eased the old latch open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several items: a leather journal, a small stack of photographs, and a set of technical drawings on heavy, high-quality paper. The journal's first page was dated 1910 and 1912. The signature at the bottom read Thomas Whitmore, and the first line chilled her. The work we do here must be preserved for those who will one day understand its purpose. The symbol serves as both identification and protection, a guide for those who know how to see. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned the page. The photographs inside showed the Whitmore family, but not as she'd ever imagined them. They stood in what appeared to be a private laboratory, surrounded by equipment too advanced for its time. Coils of wire glass, instruments, and diagrams of devices she couldn't identify. The drawings were technical, almost futuristic. Blueprints for something extraordinary. It became clear that the symbol in the family portrait wasn't decorative at all. It was a cipher, a key, a mark left behind to guard their secret work. And as the rain began to fall softly outside, Margaret realized she wasn't holding mere relics of history anymore. She was holding the first tangible evidence of a mystery deliberately hidden for over a century, a secret that someone in 1910 had gone to remarkable lengths to protect. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when Margaret carefully repacked the contents of the metal box. Whatever the Whitmore family had been doing in 1910, it was clear they'd gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure their work would be remembered, not by everyone, but by the right people, at the right time. That night, her home office was dim except for the amber glow of her desk lamp. Rain brushed softly against the window, the sound mingling with the slow rustle of pages as Margaret examined Thomas Whitmore's journal. What she read inside quietly upended everything she thought she knew about early 20th century Portland. The Whitmores hadn't simply been an educated family. They had been pioneers conducting scientific experiments decades ahead of their time. The journal spoke of a concept Thomas called photographic preservation of complex information. The accompanying sketches showed curious devices, glass cylinders, plates, and instruments for manipulating photographic emulsions. Processes that wouldn't even be publicly discussed until the 1940s. But what took her breath away was one particular passage written in neat, deliberate script. The symbol must carry forward our work. Future researchers equipped with the proper knowledge will recognize the marker and understand that this image contains more than it appears. Within the grain structure itself, our data will rest invisible to the eye, but recoverable to those who know how to look. Margaret set her coffee aside, now cold and forgotten. The implication was staggering. The symbol in the Whitmore portrait wasn't merely decoration, it was a key, a signal to those who would one day uncover the truth. The photograph itself was a vessel, hiding information no one could see. But what information? And how could it possibly be retrieved? The next morning, she called Dr. Rodriguez. When she told him what she'd found, his voice sharpened with urgency. Margaret, if that's accurate, he said, we're not just looking at an anomaly. We're looking at a scientific breakthrough hidden inside a century-old photograph. We need proper imaging tools. By afternoon, they were at Portland State University, where Dr. Rodriguez had arranged access to the imaging science department. There, under the quiet precision of sterile light, Professor Sarah Kim, an expert in historical photograph restoration, prepared to examine the Whitmore portrait. The lab was hushed except for the hum of the machines. Dr. Kim adjusted the spectral scanner, her face illuminated by the cool blue glow of the monitors. As the photograph was analyzed under different wavelengths, something remarkable began to appear. Shapes, numbers, faint geometric patterns surfacing from the invisible layers of the image itself. Dr. Kim leaned closer. "Extraordinary," she murmured. The sophistication required to embed this without disrupting the visible photograph. This shouldn't exist in 1910. Whoever did this understood the chemistry of light in a way far ahead of their time. The results deepened with every scan. Embedded within the grain were coordinates, chemical formulas, and what appeared to be architectural schematics. It became clear Thomas Whitmore hadn't just taken a family portrait. He had built a photographic vault, sealing away knowledge for future generations. "There's something else," Dr. Kim whispered, enlarging one of the readings. "These coordinates, they're local, all within Portland." Margaret's heart began to race. Could it be possible? Had the Whitmores left more clues scattered across the city? By late afternoon, she and Dr. Rodriguez had mapped the coordinates, the pins forming a subtle, deliberate pattern, an arc through the heart of old Portland. If the data were accurate, there were at least two more hiding places. The first led them to Laurelhurst Park near the pond, where children often fed ducks beneath sprawling oak trees. It was a peaceful place, too peaceful perhaps to hold such a secret. But the coordinates pointed precisely to a small memorial garden. According to old records, Margaret explained, the site had been established in 1923 by the Whitmore Scientific Foundation. Strangely, there was no trace of that foundation after that year. Dr. Rodriguez ran his hand along the stone base of the memorial. "This doesn't match the rest of the park's design," he noted. "There's a depression here, like it was built to open." Working with care, they cleared away the soil. Beneath, hidden by time and moss, they found a small metal plate engraved with the same circular symbol. It covered a narrow compartment, sealed but not impenetrable. Inside was another box, smaller but nearly identical to the one found in the Whitmore home. And within it, more photographs and a continuation of Thomas Whitmore's journal, dated 1913 to 1925. The entries expanded the mystery. We were not alone in this endeavor, one page read. Colleagues in Seattle, San Francisco, and Vancouver have established similar preservation sites. The network grows stronger as our understanding deepens. The symbol connects us all, ensuring that what we learn will one day be found by those who can comprehend it. Margaret closed the journal slowly, the weight of its words settling like a quiet storm. They were no longer tracing a single family's secret. They were uncovering an entire network, a group of early 20th century researchers bound by shared purpose, working in silence while the rest of the world slept. The second set of coordinates led them across the river to southeast Portland, an industrial district reborn as art studios and workshops. The address brought them to a century-old brick warehouse, now covered in ivy and painted murals. The current owner, Lisa Chen, a local artist, greeted them with curiosity. "I've always wondered about this place," she said, unlocking the door. "There are parts of the basement that don't make sense, old walls inside newer ones." Down in the cool, echoing basement, the air smelled faintly of metal and dust. Lisa pointed toward an uneven section of brickwork. "See that?" she whispered. "That part's not original. Behind the wall, they found it another concealed compartment sealed with care. And inside, resting in the dim glow of their flashlights, were the very instruments Thomas Whitmore had drawn in his journal over a century earlier. Glass cylinders plates, lenses each labeled with the symbol that had haunted Margaret since that first day. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The past, it seemed, had been waiting patiently for them to arrive. The apparatus before them looked like something out of another century. Precisely ground lenses, chemical vessels, and metal fittings that gleamed faintly under the lab lights. Every piece was meticulously crafted, arranged with almost reverent care. Margaret leaned closer, her breath catching as she recognized familiar details from Thomas Whitmore's sketches. This was his equipment, preserved untouched as if waiting for someone to find it again. The most astonishing discovery, however, lay inside a small wooden case lined with dark velvet. It contained dozens of delicate glass plates, photographic negatives, each protected by thin layers of paper and wax. When Dr. Rodriguez carefully lifted one to the light, faint outlines began to emerge. Faces, families, all posed with the same solemn grace that characterized early 20th century portraits. But there it was, again on every image, subtle yet deliberate. The same symbolic marker that had appeared on the Whitmore child's collar. Interlocking circles, botanical threads, and that haunting symmetry that seemed to hum with meaning. As the daylight outside began to fade, Margaret realized what she was truly holding in her hands. This wasn't a single family's curiosity, nor an isolated act of genius. This was part of something vast, a network of minds who had chosen to hide their discoveries, not in vaults or institutions, but inside images, quietly, elegantly, invisibly. By morning, the materials covered half the conference table in Dr. Elizabeth Harper's office at Portland State University. Stacks of glass plates, weathered journals, and reprinted maps surrounded them. Dr. Harper, a historian renowned for her work on early Pacific Northwest innovation, listened intently as Margaret and Dr. Rodriguez recounted every step of their investigation. "What you found?" she said softly, her eyes scanning one of the recovered plates, "appears to be evidence of an underground scientific community." The early 1900s were fertile ground for innovation, but only for those within the accepted circles. For independent researchers, especially those working outside academia, knowledge had to move differently. She spread a map across the table. It showed Seattle, Vancouver, Portland, San Francisco, each city marked with faint inked symbols identical to the one from the photograph. "I've seen this before," Dr. Harper continued, tracing her finger along the coastline. "Here in local archives, in the corners of old patents, even in margin sketches of personal letters. I always assumed it was decorative. But now, it looks like coordination. A network." The glass plates, once digitally restored, confirmed her suspicions. They weren't limited to Portland. Each photograph, each family, was part of a constellation of interconnected researchers, their portraits serving as coded archives of experimental knowledge. In the background of some faint glimpses of machinery appeared arc lamps, prisms, even rudimentary spectrographs decades ahead of their supposed invention. Thomas Whitmore's later journals revealed the true extent of their collaboration. We gather quarterly one entry read in his careful, slanted handwriting. To share what has been learned, to strengthen what has been preserved. Each of us safeguards a fragment, but the symbol ensures we will be recognized by those who come after. Margaret read the line aloud in a hushed tone. The room fell quiet. Dr. Harper leaned back, her voice low but certain. It makes perfect sense. The early 1900s were a time when knowledge was being fenced off, patents, institutions, and profit barriers. These people must have decided to create their own hidden system of record. An invisible archive distributed across families and generations. Dr. Rodriguez examined a recovered lens from the apparatus. Their work was astonishingly advanced, he said. They'd discovered chemical stabilization methods and optical recording techniques that didn't appear in mainstream science until the 1940s or later. This wasn't imitation, it was parallel evolution. Unrecognized brilliance concealed in plain sight. As the day wore on, a clearer picture began to take shape. These weren't just scientists, they were guardians of knowledge. Archivists who understood that their discoveries might be too dangerous, too misunderstood, or simply too soon for the world they lived in. Their symbol, delicate yet enduring, was a promise, a sign that one day someone would be ready to understand. Margaret sat in silence as the last sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting soft reflections across the recovered glass plates. The weight of what she had uncovered pressed gently upon her chest, a mixture of awe and quiet reverence. A century ago, the Whitmore family had posed for a portrait. Their eyes, calm and certain, seemed to gaze past time itself. And now, at last, the secret they had hidden within the grains of silver and shadow was beginning to speak again. Still, one question lingered, faint but insistent. What else had they hidden? And perhaps more unsettlingly, why? The weekend brought a soft drizzle to Portland, a kind of rain that seemed to hush the city, as if it too was listening. Margaret arrived early at the Oregon Historical Society's main research library, her satchel heavy with copies of Thomas Whitmore's journals. The quiet hum of the reading lamps and the faint scent of aged paper greeted her like old friends. She had come here countless times before, but never with a mystery like this one. Armed with names, dates, and coordinates pulled from the Whitmore journals, she began her search, city directories, archived newspapers, handwritten correspondence. Line by line, a hidden portrait of Portland's past began to emerge. Thomas Whitmore, she discovered, had not been merely an engineer. He'd been a visionary. His work on early bridge foundations and reinforced concrete design had shaped Portland's skyline, though his name had been all but forgotten. His wife Helen was equally remarkable. A botanist, one of the first women admitted to the state's Botanical Society. Her field notes described native flora not just as plants, but as living systems capable of preservation through pattern and structure. But what truly caught Margaret's attention were the other names, the families whose portraits carried the same symbol. There was Dr. Samuel Chen, an early seismologist who developed rudimentary quake sensors decades before seismology became an established field. And the Morrison family, whose agricultural experiments had transformed farming across the Willamette Valley. Each name she uncovered told the same quiet story innovators whose work had been preserved, not celebrated. Their achievements didn't appear in textbooks or university records, but their discoveries endured encoded and hidden within this mysterious symbol. By late afternoon, Margaret's notes filled pages. The deeper she went, the more she realized how deliberate it all was. The symbol network wasn't a coincidence, it was a system. Each family had maintained independent archives, cross-referenced through coded documentation and photographic markers. Together, they had built what Thomas Whitmore called the Preservation Protocol. His final journal entries, dated 1925, carried a tone of completion and quiet triumph. Phase 1 complete. Primary and secondary sites established. The photographic markers are placed. Redundant copies secured. Future researchers will find enough to reconstruct our work. But beneath that confidence was something else, a whisper of unfinished purpose. Whitmore's last pages referenced Eastern colleagues and international coordination. It was as if Portland's network was only one node in a vast, unseen web, stretching far beyond the Pacific Northwest. Margaret closed the journal slowly, feeling the chill of that realization settle in her chest. They hadn't simply been preserving science. They had been preserving civilization, anticipating a time when institutions might fail, when truth might need to be hidden, waiting for rediscovery. That evening, as she packed her papers, the library lights dimmed around her. The sense of responsibility pressed gently but insistently against her. After more than a century, the work of these forgotten pioneers had surfaced, and somehow she had become its caretaker. 2 weeks later, the conference room of the Portland Historical Society was alive with quiet intensity. Around the long oak table sat scholars and specialists: Dr. Michael Stevens from the University of Oregon's History Department, Dr. Janet Morrison from the Pacific Northwest Historical Research Center, and Dr. Robert Kim from Portland State's Imaging Sciences Division. The journal's glass plates and recovered apparatus were arranged before them like pieces of an intricate puzzle. Margaret watched as they examined each item, their faces illuminated by the pale autumn light spilling through tall windows. Dr. Stevens was the first to speak. "What you've uncovered, Margaret," he said, "slowly goes far beyond local history. This is evidence of a deliberate, structured scientific network, one that predates organized archiving by decades." He looked up from the journal's final pages, eyes shining with disbelief. The level of sophistication here, chemical encoding, redundancy, mapping its centuries ahead of its time. Across the table, Dr. Morrison gently turned over one of the recovered instruments. "These lenses," she murmured, "were ground with microscopic precision. Whoever made them had access to technology that shouldn't have existed here in 1910. It's as if they were working with the knowledge from the future." The room fell silent. Papers rustled. Outside rain whispered against the glass. Dr. Kim finally spoke, his tone more cautious but no less awed. "If the embedded data truly spans multiple regions, then we're not just looking at a local phenomenon. This could represent one of the earliest global systems of encoded communication, hidden not through secrecy, but through design." Margaret sat back, her heart quiet but full. The family portrait that had first caught her attention, a simple 1910 photograph, had become something far larger than she could have imagined. It was no longer just about the Whitmores or even Portland. It was about a hidden lineage of minds who had refused to let their discoveries be lost to time. People who had found a way to make memory itself part of their invention. The symbol on that child's collar had not only carried their legacy forward, it had been waiting for her to notice. And as she looked again at the photograph resting under the soft museum light, one lingering question refused to leave her mind. If they went to such extraordinary lengths to preserve their knowledge, what exactly were they trying to protect it from? The late autumn light filtered through the glass windows of the Portland History Institute, illuminating centuries-old photographs. Conservators stood around a long table, examining every detail on the honey-colored paper. What amazed them was not just the beauty of the photographs, but their incredible state of preservation. Materials that should have decayed over time were as intact as if they had been created decades earlier. The chemical compounds, the silver coating, and the coded symbols on the edges of the photographs all revealed a level of understanding of materials and chemistry far beyond their time. It seemed that those who lived in the early 20th century possessed knowledge that would take decades for mainstream history to acknowledge. The authentication process was meticulous radiocarbon dating, confirmed the age chemical analysis, confirmed the composition of the photos, and historical comparisons proved the identity of the people in the photos. From a small symbol in a 1910 family portrait, Margaret has opened one of the most important historical discoveries in the Pacific Northwest. In a quiet office, Dr. Kim shares the results of his technical analysis. Beneath the ordinary image, the photos contain many hidden layers of data. Not just scientific documents, but a network of records of communities, families, collaborative research, shared resources, and the development of knowledge over time. They have not only preserved knowledge, they have encoded entire miniature civilizations into these seemingly simple photographs. Margaret and her team are devising a new preservation plan to preserve documents that were designed to last for centuries. But most importantly, to publish this discovery respectfully and in the spirit of its creators. What moved me most? Margaret said at the meeting, her voice cracking in the hushed room, was the trust they had. They didn't know who would find what they left behind or when, but they believed that one day we would understand the significance of this work. That afternoon, descendants of the families in the network visited the Institute of History. Among them was James Morrison, the great-grandson of a farmer who had contributed to the agricultural innovations recorded in the network. His hands trembled slightly as he stood before his ancestors' documents. "We always heard that our great-grandfather was part of some research group," he said softly, "but I thought it was just a side story. I never thought it was a hidden part of the history of this land." Margaret looked around, realizing that this discovery connected not only the past and the present, but also the families who shared their beliefs and knowledge. Now their descendants are continuing that spirit, preserving the legacy their ancestors passed down through the century. 3 months later, the grand auditorium at Portland State University was packed. On the screen was a 1910 Whitmore family photograph where the story begins. Margaret stepped to the podium, her voice slow, warm, and full of emotion. "This symbol," she said, pointing to the faded symbol in the corner of the photo, "is not just a pattern or a family tradition. It is a sign, a key to identifying members of a secret research network that has been active throughout the Northwest since the turn of the last century." The room fell silent as she recounted the journey, from the first discovery to the recovery of hundreds of documents at multiple sites. Dr. Rodriguez presented on the techniques of photographic preservation, and Dr. Harper explained the social context where science and community collaboration were the only ways to combat the uncertainties of the times. But the most poignant moment came when Margaret revealed the network's ultimate purpose. They didn't just want to protect their work, she said quietly. They wanted to protect human knowledge, a repository of understanding and collaboration designed to survive no matter how the world changed. The symbol, upon closer examination, was revealed to be more than just a symbol. It also contained mathematical ratios and geometric principles, a visual equation for how information could be preserved and scientific collaboration could be achieved. Dr. Kim's subsequent research revealed that the network was not limited to the Northwest, but extended from Mexico to Alaska, a continent-wide knowledge storage system with each region having its own variation of the original symbol. What moved me most, Margaret said, wasn't the advanced technology, but the spirit of collaboration that went into it. They understood that knowledge is only powerful when shared, and they built a system to ensure that their work would live on into the future. The ceremony concluded with the announcement of the Pacific Northwest Scientific Heritage Archive, a collaborative research effort between universities and museums, with direct advice from the descendants of the original families. As applause filled the air, Margaret looked out at the room filled with historians, scientists, and the descendants of those who once consigned knowledge to the shadows of time. The Whitmore portrait now hangs proudly at the Portland History Institute. It is no longer just a family portrait, but a symbol of the enduring belief in knowledge and the connection between generations. And perhaps, as the lights dim and the room falls silent, you will also wonder how many other stories, how many other treasures of humanity are still quietly waiting for someone to find and light them up again.